Which player's success can make or break this season? I know we've talked about the quarterbacks a lot. I know we talked about some defensive players, but pinpointing it down to just one person whose success can make or break the Saints this season.
One person, I think it's probably Kelvin Banks is probably the guy that I would put at the top of that list. He has to come through. He has to play well. They have to have a future there. They have to know that they got anchor points for their team. It's not even just like making or breaking the 2025 season. I feel like it's like making or breaking the future of the team.
Yeah.
And I think he's got to be better than Fuaga. Like I don't even think that's a high enough bar. I think you got to exceed it and at least be on a path toward it. Maybe you don't have to exceed it today, but I think you got to be arguably the best player on that offense. Like he's going to be one of the highest drafted players on that side of the ball, and they're building everything around that. Like having the line, having that put together.
Yeah.
It's number one when Kellen Moore talks about team building and how to succeed in the NFL and what you need to do. Like he always starts with the line, and if that's what you're looking to do, you have to hit on that pick. So that's putting a lot on a young guy, but I think I look beyond this season even, and I think that it's everything is kind of riding on him being the guy.
Yeah, offensively, definitely he is that person. And just to, kind of provide another name on there, I'm going to go on the defensive side of the ball. And I'm kind of torn between two people, but having to narrow it down to one, I'll have to ride with Chase Young because of the investment that you put in him and the age on how he can kind of carry into this future segment. Because like you said with Calvin Banks, not only just him hitting this year, him hitting as a pick overall is extremely important. And I think with Chase Young, the investment that you put in, how his age, even though he's been in the league for a while, he's still fairly young. So I think him hitting is very important just for the defensive side of the ball to have an identity moving forward and have a piece on there that you can say, all right, this is a highlight piece. This is somebody who, when you come in every week, you got a game plan kind of around him because he's that much of a threat. I think he has to come up in that sense too. But the other person that I kind of was on the fence with was Alontae Taylor, kind of for some of these same reasons, but that's contingent on the extension that the Saints give him. If the Saints give him a large extension, then yes, that is now the pressure point player on the defense because of the amount of money he gets. But if they configure that somehow differently, or if they let him explore and move on, then of course that will change. But Chase Young will have to be the choice for me on the defensive side of the ball. But Calvin Banks, you can't go wrong with that because of the amount of investment, like you said, that this new regime has put into him. He was the first pick of this new head coach, and you're building everything around them.
I don't disagree with any of those. I would say that Alante is probably a pressure point player regardless. Like they need those corners to
Yeah.
play well. So even with or without the money, I think just in general, 2025 success is very contingent on him and Kool-Aid. And I think Chase is a very strong pick for this exercise. Spinning that out a little bit though,
Mhm.
I feel like him being in a position where he can be selected as that, and like the investment being part of the conversation and all that stuff. I feel like that's part of the problem with the defense is that he carries that weight. I don't think he's a guy that should be looked at as the foundational piece. Maybe he's a finishing piece, just given what he's been throughout his career. Like he might elevate into being that type of player at some point. A lot of people have been waiting for it for a long time, since 2020. Is it ever going to happen? I don't know. He does still remain young. Potential still remains there. He's the type of player that I'm okay with investing in, but I don't feel like he should be your best defensive end. And if you are saying he has to do X and Y for your team to achieve Z, I feel like there's something a little bit janky with your build. And look, that's why the Saints are kind of where they're at right now.
I know the Saints didn't pick him, but you kind of said it of him evolving into that. I don't know if that timetable kind of still exists in my eyes for him to evolve into the shoes that he's been put into being the second overall pick.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know either. I mean, it's kind of starting to reach that make or break point, and
Yeah.
maybe it's already passed. And I'm not trying to be negative or anything. I
No.
still think he can be a viable contributor on your team. But is there the reality where 7.5 sacks becomes 15? And I don't know that I personally see it, but do I think it could exist within him? I do. I do think he has that ability and that talent. And I do think that there's probably been some negative circumstances. And I do think that,
Yeah,
he
of
had the
course.
health thing and Washington was a bad place to play and all this stuff. But at a certain point, you get into an atmosphere and it has to work. And I think if very quickly here, I think we're coming up on that. Like he just is what he is. Point, and that would be okay. I'm okay with him being what he is. I will even give him a pass on last year if everything the players were, and not that he needs a pass, but just a pass on not being 12 sack, 13 sack guy, whatever. Like if the players are right about Todd Grantham and the system was kind of starting to fall apart and it was a toxic atmosphere and all this stuff, sure, maybe it is on the other side of that. But we got to see it now. Like everything's going to kind of be set up. I don't think it's a great situation still. I don't think there's a ton of talent around you. Secondary might not be great. You don't have other, anyone. There's some solid players on the line, but it isn't.
Yeah.
It isn't like, well, this guy's on the field, so he's going to get Chase easier looks, and like that isn't the thing here. That doesn't really exist. I think him and Carl are very good players to have on a team, but I don't know that anyone's necessarily changing their game plan for Brzee or Carl or Godshot to where it sets up, So it's just kind of if it's gonna happen for you, it has to happen. I don't know that I see it, but I agree with the pick. I think if he does achieve that, that's a guy that changes your narrative, and I think that you probably pinpointed maybe the guy like the pressure point guy on the team, but I just don't like the fact that he can be in that position. I think it says like, wow, like there's a lot on this like very, very big maybe that historically is trended toward not achieving like that superstar type upside.
So how do you remedy that situation? Do you cut the cord early whenever you find out that the defense maybe is not working, how it's kind of drawn up and planned to be working throughout the season? Like make some major moves at the trade deadline? Do you wait until the next draft to try to do that? But then at that same time, if quarterback doesn't work out, then you have to reinvest heavily into that. How does that work?
Well, I think that's that's where the team. I mean, those are the big questions for the whole entire
Yeah.
team. You can't really cut the cord because like what are you cutting it to? And you can't walk away from guys you just signed. There's too much money invested, so you can't really walk away from the mess and start over cleanly. At some point, that probably happens on its own, but
Mhm.
there's no easy like I don't think you go crazy at the trade deadline unless your team's looking like a playoff team. And
Right.
if
I
your
don't.
defense is looking janky, like you probably aren't looking like a playoff team. So
Yeah.
that probably isn't an answer right there. If your quarterback stinks, you aren't fixing the defensive end spots, possibly corner, possibly wide receiver, possibly quarterback. So you need the quarterback to hit to really have like to just be able to keep going forward in this rebuild. If the quarterback hits, maybe some of your wide receiver things take care of themselves. So then maybe you are in a position to look at edge rusher, depending on where you finish like in the season. Like we're assuming like a negative record here, like somewhere lower in the league to where you can strike at that. But I mean, that's the problem. And look, this has been the problem for them going back to 17, though, trying to find this other guy.
Yeah.
It's a very hard position to address with like a very long-term answer if you aren't in that category of being a bad team where you can just go get one and they're set because they don't hit the market. They did have the answer with Trey Hendrickson. Obviously, they missed it. Like that's the big one. But even outside of that, though, like out of things that they thought were gonna like, because you got lucky on Trey, a third round pick that hits, like that's just
Mhm.
pure luck. So that kind of illustrates the point even further. Like you have to get lucky and you have to be smart enough to recognize it. Most people would probably recognize it. They didn't. Probably the biggest misstep in recent franchise history outside of just completely wasting 14, 15, 16. But like once they got back on track, that's obviously the biggest mistake they made was Trey. It's not Zach Bond. Zach Bond can win all these accolades. The positional value at defensive end is insane, and you missed, and you can't find another answer for
Yeah.
it. You can go get a Demario Davis. Like those guys hit the market sometimes, and you put them in the right spot, and they thrive. So like trying to find that defensive end, it's about as hard is anything this side of getting a quarterback. Quarterbacks in a whole different stratosphere. Quarterbacks 1, 2, 3 on the list. Maybe the top 10 hardest things to do in the NFL. Like if you're
Yeah.
ranking them out, like there's a huge gap, but it's a tough thing to answer. Like getting that guy, and when you're not drafting at the top of the order, it becomes extremely difficult. So if you're still looking for the quarterback, like and you need those ends, like tough. It's gonna be hard to do both things in a timely fashion. And man, if you answered that quarterback thing, it's a lot easier to draft something that hits. Again, granted, it's still hard. We're talking about a guy that was taken second overall that hasn't met his potential, so it's not always a sure thing. And Jeff Ireland drafted the guy in Miami the one year that he traded up for that didn't hit. I think that was the Mark Ingram draft. Like that, that Deion Jordan. Like there's guys that miss high up in the NFL draft at that position. It's not a sure thing at all, but it's a lot easier to answer that question when you're in a position to strike and you aren't gambling and you aren't taking these swings and it's not we're gonna take a small school guy, gonna take another one, gonna take Foskey, it's hard. I mean, and look, people do get lucky at those other spots. I'm not saying it's like the quarterback path, but it's hard. It's hard to answer those questions. And when you're drafting a pass rusher at 20, it's very much not someone that you're like, man, I think this is a sure thing. Obviously, at 2, it's not either, but it's easier to answer those questions up high in the draft.
So it's even like a two-phase rebuild, and you can't start phase 2 unless phase 1 hits, because now you have to go back and do it again. And that's kind of what it is. Is it at 2 different levels of a rebuild? Like the offensive rebuild clearly had to take place if you wanted it or not because of the Derek Carr situation. But with the defense, they reinvested in a lot of those pieces. And Chase Young is younger. He's not the youngest. He's not kind of in that old territory. But when did they have to bite the bullet on that?
So I mean, look, the multiple step rebuild. I mean, that it goes back to the very first. It goes back to Banks. If Banks doesn't hit, like now you're at another top 10 position. If Shuck doesn't hit, you're at a top 10 position that you need to address. If N doesn't hit, you're looking in the top 10. Wide receiver, something I think can address a little bit later, but that's quickly becoming a highly like a very high positional value position. Cornerback, I think if you're looking for, hey, this is going to be like a guy that can be our defensive identity, usually that's very high in that draft order. So I mean it's tough. And then look, if you're drafting top 10 and you don't have the answer at quarterback, and like there's all these things, like you got 2 or 3 of those things you got to address, and then let's say you're picking 9th and Ed Reed 2 sitting there, Caleb Downs, now like you can't draft him because you have to address one of these other positions.
Yeah.
It just becomes a very difficult thing to put together when you're missing on these picks. And I don't know about like as it pertains to Chase Young, it becomes clear, I think, like either he's your like franchise level pass rusher at the end of the season or he's not, and it's a need. And that's something that you weigh if you're drafting early. Even if he does hit, I mean, if one of these guys that you want to take the Clemson edge rusher, like if he's sitting there, and even if let's say Chase Young has 12 and you're drafting top 5, I mean, that's something that man, 2 of them is better. You can't have enough. Like, so it's something that's on the table no matter what. But I think where you don't want it to exist at the end of this, like ideally you would like to have the flexibility of like the quarterback's answered, the left tackle's answered, and you feel solid enough about defensive end that you aren't drafting the 13th guy on your board at 7 because like you just have this need. And let's say, again, looking at like Caleb Downs, he might be number 1 on your board, but because of positional value, teams might very likely pass on him. And let's say you are drafting 6 or 7. Now he's sitting there and you got your guy that's number 1 versus your guy that's number 13. You don't want to have to take 13 because you don't have an answer at one of these other spots. And it's like, okay, we're cool with Sanker. We're okay with Reed. Can get a free safety with pick 37, pick 38, whatever, however that math works. Like you don't want to be sitting in that position where you're making that type of decision. So hopefully, like a lot of these things do hit. Hopefully, the guy you listed here hits. Hopefully the guy I listed here hits for them. And like they're in a decent spot in the draft next year.